Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today's lecture is about the period that happens after the War for Independence is ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. This particular lecture is quite important, as a matter of fact, because it covers some of the foundational moments of this country. I mean, literally creating a new nation, how it's going to run, and who that nation is for. So some big topics that we're going to look at today and kind of go over in this lecture. So please be ready for that, and understand that it will take a little bit of time to get through all of this, and that we will be looking at some pretty complex and deep subject matters. So be ready for all that. So hopefully you've done your reading and you're able to kind of follow along and see what happens here. But again, as I just said, do kind of keep in mind that we do have a major moment here, right? After the Battle of Yorktown is won in 1781, this thing called the United States now looks like it's going to be a reality. Remember, up to that moment, it was a question, right? The British government contested this. It was not an easy win for these patriots, as they called themselves. But once they did win, once they did sign a treaty with their former government, giving them their independence, then came the next crucial steps of actually creating a nation. How was that nation going to run? What were the components to it, right? Who was included in this? Who had a say in this new government? Those are all some of the big questions they have to answer. And to kind of explore all of that and to kind of understand what's going on there, we're going to go through this lecture in kind of three main sections, if you will. We're going to look at their attempts to create a working government for their nation. The fact that the first one doesn't actually solve all of their problems or just leads to a new series of problems means that they have to revisit that idea and come up with a second alternative government. That's what we know today as the United States Constitution. And then we're going to kind of explore how that new government under the Constitution actually runs, because again, it's going to bring up some of these fundamental differences that Americans have in what they think a government should be and how it should act. So again, some pretty big themes that we're going to look at here today. So we'll start with kind of creating this national government and how this all goes about. And really, to kind of look at that, we have to go back to the end of the War for Independence. Keep in mind that when the 13 colonies gained their independence from Britain, that there are still a lot of questions left to be answered then. Is this new country going to succeed? Remember, this has never really been done before. No colonies had successfully broken away from an empire and stood out as an independent nation before. They'd always been taken over by other empires, or it kind of collapsed on their own. So will this country actually succeed independent of another major European power is a big question. And then, of course, as we've seen in previous lectures, who this new country is for, who has a say in it, is a big question. People like Abigail Adams think they should have a say in things. People like Phyllis Wheatley, Mary Wollstonecraft feel they should have a say in this new country. People like George Hughes, that we've mentioned several times, feels like they should have a say in this country. So this is a big thing that has to be settled, is exactly how this country works, who is going to have a say on how it runs, and essentially what this country is all about. They put some of those ideas to paper in the Declaration of Independence, but now they needed to make a government that actually brought those things through to life. And also kind of keep this in mind. This wasn't really a war won by the Americans. For the most part, it's actually French aid that makes this possible. The victory at Yorktown doesn't happen without the French Navy, the French Army, and most importantly, French money. So this is really kind of an inauspicious beginning if you stop and think about it for the Americans. It's not really that they won this war, it's really that the British lost. They really didn't do their job, so to speak. They didn't commit themselves fully to putting down the rebellion in the colonies. And once the French came into the war, the British really focused more on defeating France than really putting down a rebellion in the American colonies. So there are some real issues there as to just how successful this country is going to be, because it doesn't really win a resounding victory over the British. The British more or less just give up and walk away. So now they've got to repair all the damage from this war and create a functioning government now that they're no longer part of the British Empire. And that's going to be a difficult thing, because if you stop and think about it, when the Declaration of Independence was issued in 1776, it really did not create one full country. It really created 13 independent countries. These 13 states, as they called themselves in the Declaration of Independence, really felt they ran themselves, that they were working together against a common foe in the British government, but for the most part, they coordinated their actions. They weren't forced to do anything they didn't want to do. So kind of keep that in mind. This new country has some big questions to answer. And also keep in mind something else that I've mentioned a couple of times. This thing called the War for American Independence is now done in 1783 when we sign a peace treaty with the British government. But this thing called the American Revolution is not done. The American Revolution is about how a country runs, who is included in that country. Independence is simply whether these states are colonies or independent states. That question is answered. But the other question about who gets to participate in these new governments created by the Declaration of Independence, what kind of country the United States is going to be, those are still things that have to be answered. And that's what we're really kind of exploring here. Now, what we're going to kind of start with is a map of the treaty, a map of the United States at the time of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. You'll notice something kind of interesting on this map. The original 13 colonies are located there along the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic where they had always been. But as I've mentioned several times in class, they have claims far to the west. And in 1783, because of the length that this war has dragged on, remember, this rebellion started in 1775. So for 8 years, these former colonies and the British government have been fighting against each other. When France and Spain come into the war, it becomes a worldwide conflict, really. It's left a lot of devastation behind. These colonies have seen a lot of devastation. Britain and France have essentially bankrupted themselves. Although the British government are going to be able to pay their bills, the French government's not going to be able to pay its bills, and it's going to cause a pretty devastating effect to the French monarchy in just a few years. And of course, on top of these kind of economic issues caused by the war comes another issue. These colonies that have existed along the Atlantic seaboard for hundreds of years, or at least 150 years in the case of most of them, they have claims to the West. And when they're hammering out a peace treaty with their former government in Paris, many of them mention that the lands to the West are theirs. And in the end, to kind of facilitate this peace deal, to get it done quickly, the British are hoping to actually kind of drive a wedge in between the French and the new United States. The British actually give a lot of that Western territory that their former colonies claimed to them in this peace treaty, as a way to kind of mollify them and quickly sign this deal over. And that raises some big questions. If you look at this map, a lot of this area is contested. A lot of these states now claim these Western territories, and they have overlapping claims. When the English and the British gave these colonies the right to form, they didn't always give them clear, definite borders. So there's a big issue here that has to be worked out, even as this country is being created and being kind of guaranteed, giving its independence. We can see that there are some big issues that have to be kind of worked out here. And actually, these colonists understand that. Now that they're independent, especially after the victories of Saratoga, they began moving in that direction, that they felt that they had a chance to win and that they would probably be able to prevail against Britain, if not, completely, at least in some form of autonomy from British government. They started working towards an idea of what they wanted as a government. And their first frame of government that they came up with, really written out of the Second Continental Congress, is what we know today as the Articles of Confederation. That was formalized in 1781 and became effective in 1783 after the British granted independence in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And again, what you have to kind of remember is that these states that are forming this government called the Articles government, they do see themselves as 13 independent states, right? As colonies, they've been independent of each other, and now as states, they see themselves as independent of each other. And after having fought a war against a powerful central government, the last thing they wanted to do was create a new powerful central government. For the most part, they saw government as a necessity, but not one that you wanted to give a lot of power to. Remember, that is essentially what most of their problems were with the British government from the Stamp Act crisis on. They wanted to give as little power and authority to that central government as possible. Well, now that they're free of the British government, the last thing that these independent states want to do is create a national government that has that same power. So in the end, this Articles government creates exactly the kind of government you would think it would, one that doesn't have a lot of power. In the end, these independent states, these 13 states, are sovereign, which means they make their own decisions within their borders. Nobody can tell them what to do, which means that this new government, this national government under the Articles, has very little power. There's not much it can do. All it can do is really request the states to do things. It can't really demand that the states do things. This new government is going to have a one-house Congress. Each of the states is going to be able to send delegates. For the most part, they send 2 to 5 delegates. But it doesn't matter how big your state is territorially, how big the population is. This new Congress ran on a one-state, one-vote process, which meant that Pennsylvania had as much power as Rhode Island, right? And those two states are very different. One is very large, very wealthy in Pennsylvania. Rhode Island has some wealth, but it's much smaller, has a much smaller population. So again, you can kind of see their ideas of wanting to kind of keep power close to home, of not giving power to other groups of people outside of their own states. It kind of shows up in this first government that they create. Another limiting factor of this new Articles Congress is the fact that any decision it made, any laws it passed, had to be unanimous. And if you think about that, getting 13 people, let alone 13 states, to agree on anything is pretty difficult. The chances of unanimity on anything other than an emergency type issue is going to be almost impossible. And again, that's what they intended. They really didn't want this Congress to do much. They wanted the states to take care of their own issues and that they just kind of deal with international issues collectively and only when they could agree on them wholeheartedly or unanimously. And of course, you see again kind of the limits of this new government. The fact is, it was not able to tax. Again, paying a tax is giving authority, giving power to something, and the last thing these states wanted to do after fighting with the British government for so long over the issue of power and authority was to give that power and authority to something else other than their state governments. So this new Articles Congress could not tax, could not really pay any of its bills, and yet it was saddled with a lot of bills from the Second Continental Congress and even assumed some of the state debts in some places. So in the end, paying back all the money we borrowed during the War for Independence was going to be quite challenging for this new national government. In fact, it couldn't even pay the interest on the loans that we had taken out to fund the war. So in the end, there's a crisis for this government before it's even officially launched. And to make things worse, trade within the states, within this new nation, was going to be regulated by the independent states, which meant they were going to do things that were best for their states. Rhode Island would pass taxes on commerce that passed through its area on its way to New York or Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania would put taxes on items that passed through it going to New York or to Virginia. In the end, trade almost ground to a halt here in the new United States by 1785, 1786 under this new government, which meant that it was very difficult for the states to raise money to help the Congress pay its bills, which meant not a lot of healing was done here at the end of from the end of the War for Independence. But it's not all bad. This Articles government, although really weak and limited in its power, was able to do some things. First and foremost, it was an official government when we gained our independence, so it did its job as far as creating alliances with countries like France and Spain, getting loans from countries like the Netherlands. It was able to function at least on some level, and we have to kind of remember that. There's also one other thing that it was able to actually do at least in some measure of usefulness. And that is it created a series of ordinances, laws, in the early 1780s into the mid 1780s to decide what to do with all of this western land that they had acquired in their peace treaty with Britain. Britain essentially understood that these colonies were going to expand into that territory, that their former colonies had claims to that western land, and at the end, the British government wasn't really going to be able to control that area anyways. It's part of the reasons why they gave that land over to the United States when it became independent in 1783. But of course, once that became part of the United States, what to do with it became the next big question. And the Articles Congress actually had to find the answers for that, find the solution for what to do with all of that land. And they did something kind of unique, which again shows that this country that we've created here is going to be different than a lot of the other countries in the world. What they could have done is they could have said the territory out west will be colonies of the original 13 states. But they chose not to do that. They decided that as populations moved west, when they reached the equivalent of any of the original 13 states, that those new states would be join into the nation and be able to kind of partake freely, equally with the original 13 states. So in a big way, we weren't going to be like Europe, which meant as people moved out there, the government had to survey this territory, had to establish kind of territorial governments, and of course start selling off land. That was the one way this Articles government could actually raise revenue, was by selling all of this western land that the states had kind of given up to the national government. So in the end, that is what they tried to do. But of course, the same problem has existed in the 1780s as it had in the 1760s, and that's that a lot of people didn't have cash, gold and silver, to buy this land, which meant speculators were the ones that did most of the buying and selling of this land, and there wasn't as much sold as the Articles government actually needed. But in the end, as people moved west, as speculators started to encourage migration westwards, these territories did start needing governments. They needed to start establishing themselves. Places like Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio had populations living in them and needed to start getting on the road to becoming states. And that's where we come to an interesting moment. That territory to the west is huge. Essentially, when we signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the size of the United States is doubled because of all this western land that the British gave up to the Mississippi River. Well, this Articles government does something kind of different with it. It splits that territory, not for the states, but based on one thing: slavery. The northern states that had already started moving away from slavery didn't want to extend slavery on their borders. Southern states, of course, that were still utilizing slave labor saw no problem with expanding the use of slave labor into new territories out west. So essentially, these Northwest ordinances, as they set up these new territories and start getting ready to add states to this new country, do something else. They use the Ohio River Valley as a boundary. All the territory north of the Ohio River Valley, slavery would not be permitted in. It'd be slave-free. South of that river, slavery would be allowed to expand into based on the desires of the people living there. So kind of think about this. The minute we have a free country, this issue of slavery has to be addressed already. And it's something that we're going to come back to again and again in this class. We've already kind of come into it, right? When the Declaration of Independence was announced in July of 1776, it made a lot of northern states uncomfortable to be talking about the rights of human beings, that all men are created equal, and then knowing that you own other human beings. That means that inherently they're not equal. It makes you sound quite hypocritical. The British brought that up many times to their former colonists, saying, how can you be talking about liberty when you own other human beings? So a lot of northern states had already been moving towards getting rid of slavery, while southern states really couldn't see a way out of using slave labor at the time. So they held on to the practice of using enslaved populations to make money, to build wealth. And here in the 1780s, they need to answer this question of whether slavery is something that the United States wants to allow or not. And they can't answer it. The northern states are fine getting rid of it, or at least not allowing it to grow. The southern states are looking to expand it. And you kind of see that half measure, right? That going halfway, trying to please both sides in these Northwest ordinances. So we kind of see that this issue of slavery is not done. It's a problem that needs to be addressed, and as it's not addressed, the problem is only going to get worse. But on a more positive note here, the one thing we should kind of take out of this is the fact that this new country isn't going to be like Europe. We're not going to use new territories as colonies for the wealth and benefit of the original states, that these new territories will be incorporated on an equal footing with the original states. And that's something that comes out of the Articles of Confederation government and is going to be included into the constitutional government when it comes along. And if you stop and think about it, that actually is a lot of territory, right? The Northwest Territory, the area that is going to be declared free of slavery, is immense. There's 5 present-day states in that territory. They could have made 6 or 7 if they had wanted to, right? Even easier. So there is this idea that slowly but surely there is going to be a lot of free states in this country, which means this issue of slavery isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But it will take time to kind of develop as we go along. Another issue that comes out of this early period for the United States under its first form of government is the fact that because the national government, the Articles Congress, has no real authority, these independent 13 states are competing against each other economically. As I mentioned earlier, they pass trade laws or trade deals that are good for them and often not good for their neighbors, which meant a lot of trade wasn't flowing very well. Also, because the Articles government had no real power, had no real authority, had no money, it couldn't deal with our national debt, couldn't make a lot of European nations happy with us, so they'd want to trade with us, so we couldn't sell a lot of the things we had to foreign governments. Now, that doesn't mean the economy wasn't healing. It was getting better, but it wasn't nowhere near where it had been just a few years earlier while we were still part of the British Empire. And a lot of governments, like the state of Massachusetts, had to pay back their massive debts that they had incurred by taking out loans from Europe during the war. And of course, that meant taxing their people. And by the 1780s, the late 1780s, these taxes were getting very, very high. And because they were using tax monies or confiscating land, it left a lot of resentment on the taxpayers, especially Western farmers who didn't have any cash, and really their only asset was their land. When they couldn't pay their taxes, those lands were confiscated, sold off, often at very low values, to pay off their debts, which of course it didn't because they weren't getting paid much for their land, and that just made them poorer and more resentful. And that's what leads to an important moment in 1787. After several years of an independent nation, things weren't getting really better. Now, it was for some people, especially those in the big port cities. They were still able to get some trade. They were still able to get some economic revival going. But in the western areas, especially on the frontiers of the country, even in a state like Massachusetts, that prosperity wasn't coming. All you felt was kind of this push by the state governments to take from you, to pay its debts down. And that's what led to a lot of resentment on the part of those Western farmers. One of those Western farmers was Daniel Shays, a former Continental soldier. He had served with Washington during the war. And now in 1787, he felt that the state of Massachusetts was acting a lot like the British government was just years before, when Massachusetts was part of the British Empire. When the Massachusetts government started sending people in to confiscate lands, to increase taxes on Western farmers, Shays and a lot of his friends, a lot of his neighbors decided no more, that they weren't going to pay those taxes, that they weren't going to accept the authority of the Massachusetts government, and they led a rebellion. Now, in the end, that rebellion is going to be put down by the state of Massachusetts. But it scared a lot of people, not just in Massachusetts, but throughout the United States, because most of the 13 states were having the same problems Massachusetts was having, paying its bills, making people happy, getting the economy revived. Even in 1785 and 1786, there have been calls for a new government to go for a new convention to fix the Articles government and to try and fix some of these big problems, especially the economic problems. But when Shays' Rebellion happens in 1787, it tells a lot of people in the United States, especially people like Washington, Madison, Alexander Hamilton, that things are not getting better, they're actually getting worse, and that they need to come up with a solution to kind of rectify the economic problems and to kind of put this country on a solid footing. Otherwise, it could fall apart relatively quickly. So in 1787, a call went out for a convention again, right? They'd already tried in 1786 to do this, but after Shays' Rebellion is put down, a lot of people felt maybe we should have a convention and see what we can do to fix the government and make things better. And in May of 1787, a group of men get together, about 55 delegates in Philadelphia, to decide what can we do to fix our government, which leads us to a thing called the Constitutional Convention. These 55 men that showed up at this Constitutional Convention, well, they all came from 12 of the 13 states. And for the most part, they were some of the richest, most educated people that those states had to offer. Really kind of the more powerful figures, people like Madison, Washington, Hamilton, people that had been leading the country as it fought for its independence and now were leading their individual states. However, there is one state that doesn't show up, the state of Rhode Island. They didn't want to fix the Articles government. They were in such debt, had so much problems, that they felt that restructuring the government would be bad for them, that the state of Rhode Island would lose power. Being the smallest state, it would be kind of at the mercy of its neighbors, and of course that they would have to raise taxes so high to pay off their state debts that it would bankrupt many of their citizens. So in the end, they decided to opt out of this convention because they didn't want to change the government, because they felt that it would be too burdensome on them. And by not participating, they felt that it meant that it couldn't be unanimous under the Articles of Confederation, and that meant that nothing could be done, which is actually kind of a smart thing on their part. But unfortunately, when the 55 delegates from the other 12 states met, they decided things are so bad we need to do it regardless of whether Rhode Island approves or not. So immediately the Articles were discarded. People said, we can't fix it, Rhode Island's not here to ratify it anyways, let's just move on and try to figure out what will work. And what we notice is that pretty quickly there were competing interests here, is the best way to look at this. The delegates, while they all kind of had a similar background, educational levels, economic interests, they still came from very diverse states. And they had some very different ideas on the way government should work as well. Some of them wanted to guarantee personal freedoms as much as possible. Others felt that we needed a strong, stable government, much like the British government, to kind of bring the country in line and to fix a lot of its problems. Then, of course, you have smaller states like Connecticut and New Jersey that were afraid of the power and the populations that bigger states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York had. So you have a lot of competing interests here in this federal convention when they're trying to decide how best to make a government that could function and really help this country out. And these issues are going to have to be settled as they go through. One of the first plans that's put forward here in this Constitutional Convention is put forward by the state of Virginia. It was put forward by a man by the name of Edmund Randolph, a neighbor of George Washington's, who's also one of the delegates there. Washington's going to be appointed the president of the Constitutional Convention. Most people felt that they could trust him to kind of be unbiased, that they could trust him to kind of do what was in the interest of everybody, not just the state of Virginia, much as he had when commanding the Continental Army during the war. Edmund Randolph then was the spokesperson for the state of Virginia, but he wasn't really the guy writing most of this. The person that was behind Edmund Randolph is a man by the name of James Madison, who's going to come to do a lot of the work on the Constitution. And Madison, in turn, is going to take a lot of his ideas from a person that's not at this convention, a man by the name of John Adams, who actually designed Massachusetts state government, the one that most of the other states acknowledged was probably the best form of government that had been created out of the 13 original states. So the plan that was put forward by Madison through Randolph essentially kind of spoke to the issues that large states wanted to deal with. Because Virginia had a big population, it wanted a government based on population representation, which meant the more people you had, the more say you had in the government. Now, they did understand that there should be multiple branches of government. Again, this idea of checks and balances was very much a British ideal that these colonists had adopted to and believed in and kind of instituted in their state governments, and they wanted to do it on the national scene as well. So the Virginia plan was going to have an independent judicial branch, an executive branch, and of course a legislature. And they were going to have two houses of Congress for this new government. But each of those houses would be based on the population of your state. So the more people you had in your state, the more representation you had in that House of Congress, and the more say you had on what laws would be passed. For big states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York, that sounded good. But for small states like New Jersey, that was bad. William Patterson, a delegate for the state of New Jersey, countered Madison's plan and the Virginia plan with kind of a revamping, if you will, of the Articles government. Essentially, keep one house of government, keep one state, one vote, just like in the Articles government, but give that government, this new government, the ability to regulate trade, tax foreign goods, what we would today call a tariff, right? Foreign goods coming into the country would be taxed, the government would get money that way to pay its bills, and the consumers, if they wanted to buy those items, would pay the taxes to the government. So essentially, smaller states wanted to limit the power of larger states, but they understood that they had to give some kind of power to the central government so it could pay its bills. In the end, that didn't work, though. It still wouldn't deal with a lot of the major problems, especially with trade within the states, that needed to be answered. So in the end, they had to do something that they're going to do many times in this convention, and that is compromise. And that comes through a thing called the Connecticut Compromise, put forward by the delegate from Connecticut, Roger Sherman. He shuttled between these two groups, the big states and the small states, and worked out a deal that would work for everybody. In the end, they would have three branches of government, an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branches. In that legislative branch, there would be two houses of Congress, what's called a bicameral Congress. One would be based on representation, on population. The other would be one state, one vote, right? Or equal representation for each state, regardless of how many people, regardless of the size of the state. That would become what would be known as the United States Senate. So the House of Representatives would be one of these houses based on population. The other house would be the Senate, where states have equal votes regardless of their population or territorial size. In the end, that was something that most of the delegates could agree to, that it seemed like nothing could be done without the small states approving it in the Senate, and the big states in the House had more of a say, which is what they wanted. But there is a compromise within this compromise, and that is one that dealt with how to count population. In the end, every person was going to be included in your population, men and women. But that led to an unusual issue. Southern states wanted to include somebody else, their slave population, because of course that would be good for them, would give them higher representation. Northern states noted, however, that Southern states didn't allow slaves to vote, didn't allow slaves to own property, didn't allow slaves freedom, of course, so why should they count towards the population? Slave owners again and again declared that slaves were property, not people. Northern states said, well, if they're property and not people, then they shouldn't count towards population. Southern states, of course, were afraid that they would lose out to more populous northern states like Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts, which had already decided to start getting rid of slavery. That if southern states like Virginia and South Carolina didn't get to count their slave population, they would quickly be limited in the power they would have in the House of Representatives. And as the Northwest Territories filled up, there'd be more northern states without slavery than southern states with slavery. So in the end, they came up with another compromise. Instead of settling this issue right here, whether we're going to have a nation that has slavery or not has slavery, they decided to do a half measure again, much like they had during the Articles of Confederation government. They counted slaves as 3/5 of a person, essentially saying that for every 5 slaves, it counted as 3 people towards population. But the way it was written out came out to be each slave was 3/5 of a person. So not a full person for representation, but at least somewhat of a representation as a person. So the enslaved population was discounted almost immediately. And of course, that is going to lead to big problems down the road. Southern states now have more representation in Congress than they should have. Northern states are going to resent this inflation of Southern interests. And of course, they're going to fight back against that, wanting to limit the growth of this institution. So we can see that we've really kind of set things up for future problems here by ignoring kind of the ultimate answer of whether slavery is legal or illegal throughout the entire United States. But in the end, this compromise, the 3/5 compromise, did allow for a movement forward here. Together, they could take this package of this new form of government to most of the states. But I do want to come back to this issue of slavery just really quickly here. Because right across from the Philadelphia State House, what we now know as Constitutional Hall in Philadelphia, there was a place, the London Coffee House, where most of the delegates went for their lunches and their dinners, where they often talked about these issues outside of the convention itself. And you'll notice that right outside the coffee house there in this picture where the red circle is, they're holding a slave auction there. So this issue of slavery was front and center as they're trying to create this new form of government. And what you'll notice is they are trying to avoid it absolutely at all costs. The word slave and slavery almost never appears in the Constitution. It appears briefly in the 3/5 clause. It does talk about the international slave trade as well, that Congress couldn't pass any laws to stop the importation of slaves for 20 years if this new government goes into effect. And that's about the only times they talk about slavery. They try to avoid this as much as possible. They just saw it as too divisive. And what we kind of have to understand is, could they have? Could they have fixed this problem right then and there? And to me, the answer is yes. Many people, even some in the South, saw slavery as a national sin, as a problem, as a bad thing that probably needed to go away. Washington himself was grappling with this idea throughout the entire War for Independence. Now in the 1780s, he's still trying to decide whether he should own slaves or not. Thomas Jefferson also going through that as well, trying to decide if slavery was really something that was good for the soul of the nation. So there actually is a lot of opportunity here, if you will, to kind of say maybe this isn't the best way to go forward for a nation that declares itself based on liberty and equality. Also, something to kind of think about is the fact that the southern states really are weak at that particular point. They're split. A lot of small farmers don't own slaves. They would like to see slavery gone because that would weaken the power of the wealthy that dominated Southern society. So this would be a way for them to kind of improve their lot. So there's a lot of white Southerners at the time that would be on board with getting rid of slavery. And even if the southern states said that they were going to fight against the northern states, in the end, they probably wouldn't have had much more success than they did generations later during the Civil War. They ultimately would have failed. So, and then it didn't even have to come to fighting, really, if you stop and think about it. With all this land out west that still wasn't occupied by white settlers, you could have given over land to slave owners and said, okay, now you own a lot of land out west. Do what you want with it. Free your slaves. They're now free. You still have a lot of land. You still have a lot of wealth measured that way. So there were solutions available, but they'd be hard. They would not make everybody happy. Somebody would resent it and fight back. And because of that, they decided to put this issue on hold, which of course just means this problem is going to get worse, not better, as we go along. And in the end, they kind of failed to live up to their own ideals if you stop and think about it. So that's one of the things that makes this issue of slavery in the United States just such a tragedy, and that we fail to really live up to it several times, from our founding fathers all the way through almost to today, right? So this is a issue that we'll come back to, as I've said before, again and again throughout the course of the semester. Now, of course, once they did hammer out these compromises and come up with a working form of government to replace the Articles government, it's not a done deal just because they created it in this convention. It needed to go back to the states. And of course, one of the things they wanted to make sure was it did not have to be unanimous. They knew that states like Rhode Island were not going to approve of any of the changes that they made to the government in the Constitutional Convention. So they changed it to 3/4. They said if 9 out of the 13 original states was okay with it, then this new form of government would go in. But what they found out was that even though a lot of people trusted men like Washington, who were delegates to the Constitutional Convention, that a lot of people were afraid of this new government, that it really seemed to be very powerful, and it really seemed that it looked a lot like the British government that they had just fought against hard for a whole generation now. So in the end, this was not going to be an easy sell, which meant supporters of this new government, the Constitution, calling themselves Federalists, had to go about and try and sell this to the people, try and convince people to support this new government, for the states to ratify them in their state constitutional conventions, and to go ahead and change our form of government. For the most part, these Federalists were people that were tied to trade, lived in urban centers, especially in New England, or maybe were big exporters in the South, like for rice or tobacco. They were people that needed a well-organized government to open up trade with foreign countries, to regulate trade within the states so that you could buy and sell products across state lines. For them, this government made sense and looked to be a promising one to fix a lot of our economic woes in this country. On the other side, of course, were these anti-federalists, people that didn't want to change this form of government. For the most part, they were the working poor in the urban centers in places like New York and Philadelphia. But really, most of them were small farmers, Western settlers that really didn't want to see a powerful state government, let alone a powerful federal government, making them pay taxes or telling them where they could and couldn't live. Many anti-federalists were like this quote from one of the members of the New York State Convention, that this new government would fall into the hands of the few and the great, that this will be a government of oppression, because this new government actually had power. It could tax, it could declare war. Its laws superseded state laws. And that was scary if you were somebody that didn't have a lot of power, didn't have land. You didn't feel like you would have a voice in this new government. So in the end, these constitutional conventions where they needed to ratify this new form of government would be quite contentious affairs, which brings us to a couple of the sources that we've looked at for this class. One of the people in the Virginia Constitutional Convention was a man by the name of Patrick Henry, somebody that had been opposing the British government since 1765. The man that famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death," when he was talking about things like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act in the 1760s. Well, he's still around here in the 1780s. He's been the governor of Virginia. He's been an important figure in Virginia. He's a slave owner, and he does not like this new government. And if you stop and look at that document, right, Patrick Henry, his reasons against why the state of Virginia should not ratify the government, he kind of tells you what side he's on, whether he's an anti-federalist or a federalist, right? He says that, look, this country's doing fine. It's doing great. We've won our freedom from Britain. These states are doing their own thing. Keep things going. In the end, Henry, like a lot of anti-federalists, likes the idea of states being in charge. The less power on a national level, the less problems the country will have. He feels that people are best represented by their state governments. And also, Henry feels that this constitutional convention wasn't actually legal, that it didn't have the authority to form a new government and to propose a change on the massive scale that it is. That he felt that the only thing that those delegates to that Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia were authorized to do was to fix the Articles of Confederation, which they didn't even do. But in the end, there's also one other thing that Henry's got in the back of his mind. Not only is this government powerful, not only can it tax you, not only can it tell states what to do, but it might have enough power to do something else: end slavery. Henry points out in this document that the northern states are growing faster than the southern states. And even with the 3/5 clause, eventually there'll be more people living in the north than in the south. And if there's more people in the north, they'll be able to settle territories out west faster, which means there'll be more northern states than southern states. And in the end, if they control both the House and the Senate, they'll be able to pass laws that northerners like that southerners don't, like ending slavery. And Henry tries to point out that's how powerful this new government is, that it could actually do something that southerners don't like, and they really wouldn't have any recourse, any way to fight back against it. So for all those reasons, Henry says you need to oppose this new form of government. On the flip side, James Madison, the man that helped write the Constitution, said, well, wait a minute. Things aren't great. The Shays' Rebellion proved that a lot of these states are having problems and that we need to actually fix the national government. And you can't fix the Articles government because it doesn't have any real power. So he said we need to build a new government. This Constitution can actually get things done that the Articles government couldn't do. And then he goes a little bit further, showing how he's a Federalist. He says, look, this is a limited government. Yes, there's a powerful national government, but the state governments are still there, and heck, even local governments are still there. That's what federalism means, multiple layers of government. And in the end, he said, you shouldn't fear this government because the same people running the government now are going to be the people running it later. And in the end, if you don't like the decisions they make, you always have the recourse of elections and voting those people out of office. He said, ultimately, the Constitution starts with the first three words, we the people, because that's who's ultimately in charge of this government. Anti-federalists like Henry felt the state should be in charge, that that's who represented the people. But Madison felt that the national government was actually a government of the people, as a whole, as a nation. So in the end, states like Virginia and others had to make this decision, whether they would institute this new government or not. And as compelling as James Madison's arguments were, and they were very compelling to a lot of people, they still weren't enough for most. People like Hamilton, people like Madison, people like John Jay, who were all supporters of this new government, had to go out and try and sell it to people, trying to tell people why this new government's a better form of government, why this Constitution will be better for them, better for the nation, help protect and add prosperity to the nation. And they did that in a series of papers called the Federalist Papers, where they kind of pointed out why you should support this thing, why you should be okay with this new form of government. And even that wasn't enough. There had to be something else. Anti-federalists like Henry just were not going to support this new Constitution without something else. And that's where this Bill of Rights comes in. James Madison actually writes several of these new limits to the federal government's powers that we know today as the Bill of Rights. Things like the First Amendment, guaranteeing freedom of religion and speech. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment, not posting soldiers in your home in the time of war. All things that the British government had tried to do to their colonists at one point or another. That was what really won over a lot of anti-federalists, guaranteeing certain rights that they felt they had fought for against the British and now were kind of threatened of losing under this new form of government. And in the end, that Bill of Rights, or at least the promise of adding them to the Constitution, was what won over a lot of states to support the Constitution and ratify it. So by June of 1788, almost a year after the document was created, the Constitution was finally officially ratified by 9 states and would go into effect. The only question now was who to put in charge of this government. And that's what brings us to this man that we've come to over and over again, George Washington. He's going to be the first and only president ever unanimously selected by the Electoral College. And we do have to kind of ask ourselves, why is Washington being chosen over and over again to lead things like the nation under the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the Continental Army? For the most part, it's because they felt they could trust him. He was one of the few people that would say outright that he listened to the will of the people, that he believed in civilian authority over military authority. That's why he got command of the army outside of Boston in 1775. He proved it when he refused to use the army to overthrow the Second Continental Congress when his own officers asked him to take over because they hadn't been paid and they didn't have supplies for the army. Over and over again, this man proved that he could be trusted with power. And in the end, that's the one person they felt wouldn't abuse that power under a government that they all acknowledged had real authority, could really do things to people. You wanted somebody that wouldn't abuse that power. But if you stop and think about what Washington was getting into, it was kind of an ungrateful thing to do to a man that had already done so much for his country. This country was essentially bankrupt, couldn't pay its bills. We had no functioning economy on a national scale, although some of the states were doing okay. Many of them couldn't trade with each other, let alone other countries. And of course, people out west didn't have protection. As people moved out west, they were forcing Native Americans off their lands, and of course that led to conflict. The federal government had to be able to solve this problem, but it had no money, had no authority at this point, had to be created from scratch. So when you look at it, Washington was given a pretty difficult task here as president. And on top of that, international relations were going to add even more problems to his presidency. When he becomes president of the United States in 1789, our ally, France, has a revolution, largely based on the ideas that we said we fought for against the British in the War for Independence. Those ideas went home with a lot of French soldiers to France, and as their government under the king, Louis XVI, initiated tax after tax to help pay for all the money that France spent getting us our independence, they rebelled against it. The people of France wanted the same rights, the same authority personally that Americans said that they had in their new country. And in the end, it led to a revolution as people like King Louis XVI and the French nobles didn't want to give up that authority and that power. The people of France rose up against them, and it led to a bit of a breakdown in French society for almost 5 or 6 years. By 1793, the King of France himself was killed by his own people. And in the end, as Europe looked at that, they said that can't happen. Kings can't just be killed by people rising up against the due authority of the government. So European countries started to go, which were all monarchies, went to war against France. And of course, France, that had an alliance with the United States, expected us to come and help them. Washington realized that we couldn't. We didn't have an army, we didn't have a navy, there was no way we could really help them, we didn't have money, so we couldn't even fund them. So in the end, Washington stayed neutral, which just angered a lot of French people who said, hey, wait a minute, we helped you get your independence, now we want the same rights and freedoms that you guys have, help us get them. And the United States essentially tried to stay out of it. But in the end, Europe becomes a bit of a war zone all over again. Just a few years after one war ended, here comes another war. But this time, France is winning. All through the early 1790s, French armies are marching across Europe. They're finding a lot of other people in Europe that like some of the ideas the French are bringing with them, those ideas that they picked up from the Americans about equality and liberty. So Europe is becoming a bit of a basket case here. And of course, that's going to make problems even harder for the Washington administration. In the end, Washington's going to have several voices in his ears trying to tell him what to do. Federalists say, don't side with the French. Side with the British. The British are who we've always traded with. The British have a bigger economy. The British are the ones that are going to win this. Stick with them. Of course, on the other side, those former anti-federalists often came down on the side saying we need to really support France. They helped us. It's our turn to help them. We need to support our ideals, even if they're somebody else's now, right? That France was fighting for the same principles as Americans, and as such, we should fight for those principles in other places as well. So in the end, Washington has a lot of issues that he has to settle. And he really kind of comes down to two major voices inside of his administration. One is his former chief of staff or secretary, however you want to describe him, served with him in the Continental Army during the war, is Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is what we would call a nationalist. He's also a Federalist. He helped write the Federalist Papers. He was there at the Constitutional Convention. He very much likes this new form of government. And he's a bit afraid of popular rule. He really likes the idea of elite, educated, wealthy men like himself running the country, that people like himself had the best education, had the best ideas, had more knowledge, they'd make good choices. He really didn't like poor people, people without land, making a lot of decisions. Some of the things that happened in the Constitutional Convention, things like the Electoral College choosing presidents, increasing the number of people that each representative represents in the House of Representatives. Those were ideas that he was very much for, because it kind of limited democracy. It made it more representation, less direct representation. And in the end, he's the one advising Washington to stay out of the French Revolution. He's advising Washington to concentrate on building up the American economy and just kind of leaving Europe alone if at all possible. If not able to stay out, then go in on the side of Britain, because that's who was going to win that war with France anyways. And in the end, this guy, Hamilton, found that he was posed by somebody else. One of those, not necessarily an anti-federalist, but somebody who was a little afraid of this new form of government, this thing called the Constitution, is also in Washington's government. He's Washington's Secretary of State, and that's Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson would become a figure, important figure in a new emerging group of people, these anti-federalists who really kind of didn't like the power that this new government had. Well, now they're coalescing around Thomas Jefferson and forming a political party. Federalists that had supported the Constitution are now forming a political party of their own around people like Alexander Hamilton. And in the end, Washington's going to have these two voices, Hamilton telling him to focus on the economy, build up the power of the government, use the power of the government to fix problems, and people like Jefferson saying, give people as much freedom as possible, look at how well our revolution, our ideals are spreading across the world, let's not create a government like Britain's government. That would go against all the things we said we were fighting for in the war for independence. So if you're Washington, you really have your cabinet's torn, right? Your government's got conflicting ideas in it, and you're going to have to make a decision over and over again. Now, one of the things I will tell you to do is go and watch one of the videos in our Chapter 7 module, and it's also, I believe, in Chapter 8 module, Hamilton versus Jefferson. It's a short clip from a not a documentary, but a HBO miniseries called John Adams. And it really does highlight this emerging political argument in the United States between Federalists and Democratic Republicans as to how governments should function, who governments should work for, and what governments should be interested in. It's a fundamental problem that they're going to have to answer, and Washington's going to have to make a decision as to which direction he's going in over and over again. So do watch that video, and after you watch it, then come back to the lecture and pick it up from there. All right, so now that you've watched the video, you'll kind of understand that essentially Hamilton has Washington's ear. Hamilton's ideas become Washington's ideas. And in the end, Jefferson can complain a lot, he can fight back a lot, but he's not going to be able to convince Washington to take his side in things. So Hamilton's plans start becoming the government's plans in a very real way. And you see that in 1790. About a year into his administration now, Washington has Hamilton propose a thing called the Funding and Assumption Plan, that essentially Congress, the federal government, is going to consolidate all the debt, foreign and domestic, for the entire country, which is tens of millions of dollars, which would be hundreds of billions of dollars in today's terms. Essentially saying, look, we have to establish credit. This country has to prove it can pay its bills. So to do that, he wants to bring all the debt in the country under the burden of the Congress, of the federal government. Take debt from the states, transfer it to the federal government. The reason behind that is if the federal government owes you money, you'll support it. Because if the federal government goes out of business, you just lost all of your money. It's a brilliant plan, and it works. Federalists are dominating the new Congress as it sits, and they quickly ratify the Funding and Assumption Plan, which means now that the federal government has a debt, of course, it's going to need to start passing taxes and also organize that debt, which brings us to a thing called the first U.S. bank. In that video that you should have watched, there's an interesting moment where Hamilton and Jefferson are kind of reintroducing themselves to each other. And Jefferson mentions how he was our ambassador to France. He saw the revolution taking hold there, and he's quite encouraged that American ideals were spreading across the country. And then he looks across at Hamilton and he says, you know, I know who I am. I'm the Secretary of State for this government. It's listed in the Constitution as a position that needs to be filled. And then he looks at Hamilton, Jefferson does, and he goes, who are you to be here, right? He knows who Hamilton is, but he doesn't know what the Secretary of Treasury is supposed to be. It doesn't exist in the Constitution. It's been created by Hamilton and Washington to be a position for Hamilton to advise the president on economic matters. Well, that argument that they're having is what this first U.S. bank is all about. Once we have a debt, we have to organize this debt. We have to kind of fund that debt. And Hamilton says, let's create a national bank to do that. We're going to give it a 20-year charter, and the government will control 20% of that bank's stock. But that means 80% of the bank isn't under the government's control, which means that really the government doesn't even run this thing that has the government's money. That's going to be controlled by wealthy bankers. And a lot of people like Jefferson, these Democratic Republicans, former anti-federalists, looked at this and said, hey, wait a minute. There is nothing about a bank in the Constitution. This will give a lot of power to this federal government. Now that it has all this debt, it can raise a lot of taxes to pay that debt, and there's nothing we can do about it. And of course, the people that are running this bank will take care of themselves. Now, Hamilton would counter, no, they're going to do what's good for the nation because they need to make money. And if they're making money, makes money for the country, it means we can pay our bills. And yes, of course, we're going to have to raise taxes because that's how governments pay off bills, right? And then comes the big part about this. Hamilton says, I understand that you can dislike the idea of the bank, but it's not unconstitutional. He says you look at one part of the Constitution and it says Congress has the right to pass all laws that are deemed necessary and proper. That clause, it's only 12 words in the Constitution, or 11 words in the Constitution, but that necessary and proper clause in Article 2, Section 7 absolutely can be interpreted as basically saying that Congress can do whatever it needs to, whatever it wants to. It's what we would call today a loose interpretation of the Constitution. People like Jefferson, former anti-federalists, now Democratic Republicans, they believe in what's called a strict constructionist view of the Constitution, that if it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it. So once again, here in the first administration under the Constitution, in Washington's administration, if you're Washington, you have to decide which one of these guys is right. Can you do whatever you need to do to make the government and the nation function? That's Hamilton's position. Do you believe that that's legal? Or are you like Jefferson, where you say, no, there's a lot of limits here. The government can only do what it's allowed to do under the Constitution. Otherwise, you have to change the Constitution. You want to make a bank? Write an amendment. You want a Secretary of the Treasury? Write an amendment. Hamilton would say, well, that's ridiculous because you'll have so many amendments, nobody will be able to keep track of anything. Just pass laws. That's Congress's job, to pass laws. Both men have some interesting points, and Washington has to decide. And what we find is, time and time again, Washington decides with only one of those two men, Hamilton. That even if he isn't in fact, he is in practice, Washington is a Federalist. He likes the idea of a strong, powerful government, and he wants to solve these problems. And this government gives him the power to do that. And he'll be on that side time and time again. And of course, once we have a bank, we have to do what we've always feared, and that's start taxing the public. One of the first taxes Washington's administration does is a thing called the whiskey tax, which says to farmers out west especially, you have to pay a tax on the alcohol you produce. Why are they producing a lot of alcohol? Because it's an easy way to transport your goods to market. If you're a Western farmer, it takes a long time to get your wheat or your other crops to market. A lot of times there's spoilage, so you make less money. You can make a lot more money by turning your crops into whiskey and alcohol and then selling it on the open market. The federal government recognized that and passed a law in 1794 to help fund this debt that we just incurred through the funding and assumption plans, and started a rebellion, actually. Western farmers said they did not want to pay these taxes, much like Shays' followers back in 1787 said they didn't want to pay taxes to the Massachusetts state government. Western farmers, especially in Pennsylvania, said they didn't want to pay taxes to the federal government that they felt were unfair and burdensome on them. They rose up in rebellion against this government, much as they had against their state government years before and against the British government years before that. And once again, we see that which side Washington's on here. People like Jefferson said, these farmers are perfectly right in going against this tax, that they're just standing up for their rights, that they're opposing a big, powerful government that's not doing anything for them. But Washington said, no, this is passed by Congress, it's a legal tax, and people have to pay the tax. He actually called out the military, the militia for the state of Pennsylvania, and personally led it for several miles out of the nation's capital of Philadelphia at the time to go crush this rebellion. And when the army showed up, this rebellion collapsed. Nobody wanted to fight against the military. And in the end, Washington and the Washington's administration demonstrated that this new government actually has powers, that it actually can solve problems. Maybe not the way everybody wants it to, but it actually can get things done, which is exactly what anti-federalists like Henry had warned people about, that this government would have a lot of power and it would use that power sometimes against you. So these issues of how much power a government should have, just how far and what things a government can do, our government can do, they've been baked into the situation from the very beginning. And it's still things that we grapple with as a nation 230 years later. One last point about the Washington administration here is something else that happens after the Whiskey Rebellion's put down in 1795. And that's that Washington sent a diplomat, John Jay, a Federalist, to Europe, especially to Britain, to try and improve trade relations and kind of solve some of the lingering issues that had still not been resolved from the Treaty of Paris in 1783. When John Jay got home from negotiating this treaty with Britain, many Americans hated it. It seemed like we were taking Britain's side against France in the war in Europe. It seemed like we cared more about being part of the British Empire again than being an independent nation again. A lot of Democratic Republicans saw this as kind of a betrayal of what the country was about. Now, interestingly, most people condemned John Jay for the treaty and not Washington, the man that authorized him to go do the treaty in the first place. But it does kind of show that there's some issues here, that these Democratic Republicans aren't happy, They're not happy about what Hamilton's economic plans are. They're not happy about the taxation that the Federalists are pushing through Congress. And now they're not happy about the United States' kind of international relations, that we seem to be taking Britain's side in this war in Europe rather than our allies' side, France. And it means that there are a lot of issues still to come about. And that's where we'll pick it up in our next lecture video on Jefferson and kind of his ability to kind of dominate this period and become the figure of that particular time. But the thing I want to kind of leave you with is kind of remember that here at the end of Washington's administration, we very much have a real political system emerging. These Federalists, people that originally had just supported the Constitution and the federal system, have now coalesced around Hamilton into a political party. People that want to kind of limit the power of popular democracy, people that want to build up the economic interests of the nation, people that are interested in trade and a powerful government. Opposing them are these Democratic Republicans led by people like Jefferson, people that have more limited interests in foreign dealings, definitely do not want to pay a lot in taxes, especially if you own a lot of land or you don't have any land, don't have a lot of wealth. Neither of those groups want to pay much in taxes. And of course, they don't want to be told what they can and can't do with their land or where they can and can't go to acquire land. So going forward here, at the end of Washington's administration, just how much power this government has and who's going to be able to wield that power are going to be important questions that have to be answered.